Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of Falling Asleep with Ava. Since we all have more and more anxiety and everybody has a lot of worries and people can't sleep and some people like my voice, I thought that maybe I could help you out a little bit and read some short stories to you while you're trying to go to bed. So for today's first episode, I chose Alain de Botton, Est is in Love, and we're going to be reading a story called The Fear of Happiness. Okay, I hope you made yourself comfortable. I hope you're tucked in. You could close your eyes and breathe with me for a couple of breaths. Maybe a shorter inhale and a longer exhale. Let's begin. The fear of happiness. One of love's greatest drawbacks is that, for a while at least, it is in danger of making us seriously happy. Number 2. Chloe and I chose to travel to Spain in the final week of August. Travel, like love, an attempt to follow a dream into reality. In London, we had read the brochures of Utopia Travel, specialists in the Spanish rental market, and had settled for a converted farmhouse in the village of Aras de Alpuente, in the mountains behind Valencia. The house looked better in reality than it had in the photographs. The rooms were simply but comfortably furnished. The bathroom worked. There was a terrace shaded by vine leaves, a lake nearby to swim in, and a farmer next door who kept a goat and welcomed us with a gift of olive oil and cheese. Number 3. We had arrived in the late afternoon, having hired a car at the airport and had driven up the narrow mountain roads. We immediately went for a swim, diving into the clear blue waters and drying off in the dying sun. Then we had returned to the house and sat on the terrace with a bottle of wine and olives to watch the sun set behind the hills. Isn't it wonderful? I remarked lyrically. Isn't it? Echoed Chloe. But is it? I joked. Shush, you're ruining the scene. No, I'm serious. It really is wonderful. I could never have imagined a place like this existing. It seems so cut off from everything, like a paradise no one's bothered to ruin. I could spend the rest of my life here, sighed Chloe. So could I. We could live here together. I'd tend the goats, you'd handle the olives. We'd write books, paint, and... Are you all right? I asked, seeing Chloe suddenly wince with pain. Yeah, I am now. I don't know what happened. I just got this terrible pain in my head, like an awful throbbing or something. It's probably nothing. Ah, no. Shit. There it comes again. Let me feel. You won't be able to feel anything. It's inside. I know, but I'll empathize. God, I'd better lie down. It probably just is the traveling or the height or something, but I'd better go inside. You stay out here. I'll be fine. Number 4. Chloe's pains did not get better. She took an aspirin and went to bed, but she was unable to sleep. Unsure of how seriously to take her suffering, but worried that her natural tendency to play everything down meant it was probably extremely serious, I decided to get a doctor. The farmer and his wife were in the cottage eating dinner when I knocked and asked in fragments of Spanish where the nearest doctor could be found. It turned out he lived in Vilar del Arzobispo, a village some 20 kilometers away. Dr. Saavedra was immensely dignified for a country doctor. He wore a white linen suit, had spent a term at Imperial College in the 1950s, was a lover of the English theatrical tradition, and seemed delighted to accompany me back to assist the maiden who had fallen ill so early in her Spanish sojourn. When we arrived back in Arrasda al Puente, Chloe's condition was no better. I left the doctor alone with her and waited nervously in the next room. 10 minutes later, the doctor emerged. "Is nothing wrong to worry about. She'll be okay?" "Yes, my friend. She'll be okay in the morning." "What was wrong with her?" "Nothing much, really. A little stomach, a little head. It's very common among the holiday makers. I give her pills. Really just a little Anhedonia in the head. What do you expect?" Dr. Saavedra had diagnosed a case of Anhedonia, a disease defined by the British Medical Association as a reaction remarkably close to mountain sickness, resulting from the sudden terror brought on by the threat of happiness. It was a common disease among tourists in this region of Spain, faced in these idyllic surroundings with the sudden realization that earthly happiness might be within their grasp, and prey, therefore, to a violent physiological reaction designed to counteract such a daunting possibility. Because happiness is so terrifying and anxiety-inducing to accept, somewhat unconsciously, Chloe and I had always tended to locate hedonia either in memory or in anticipation. Though the pursuit of happiness was our avowed goal, it was accompanied by an implicit belief that it would be realized somewhere in the very distant future, a belief challenged by the felicity we had found in Arrasda al Puente and, to a lesser extent, in each other's arms. Why did we live this way? Perhaps because to enjoy ourselves in the present would have meant engaging ourselves in an imperfect or dangerously ephemeral reality, rather than hiding behind a comfortable belief in an afterlife. Living in the future perfect tense involved holding up an ideal life to contrast with the present, one that would save us from the need to commit ourselves to our situation. It was a pattern akin to that found in certain religions, in which life on earth is only a prelude to an everlasting and far more pleasant heavenly existence. Our attitude towards holidays, parties, work, and perhaps love had something immortal to it, as though we would be on the earth for long enough not to have to stoop so low as to think these occasions finite in number, and hence be forced to draw proper value from them. If Chloe had now fallen ill, was it not perhaps because the present was catching up with her dissatisfaction? The present had, for a brief moment, ceased to lack anything the future might hold. But was I not just as guilty of the disease as Chloe? Had there not been many times when the pleasures of the present had been rudely passed over in the name of the future? Love stories in which, almost imperceptibly, I had abstained from loving fully, confronting myself with the immortal thought that there would be other love affairs I would one day try to enjoy with the insouciance of men in magazines, future loves that would redeem my calamitous efforts to communicate with another whom history had set spinning on the earth at much the same time as me. The future has some of the satisfactions and safety of the past. I recalled that as a child, every holiday grew perfect only when I was home again, for then the anxiety of the present would make way for stable memories. I spent whole childhood years looking forward to the winter holidays when the family took 2 weeks to go skiing in the Alps. But when I was finally on top of a slope, looking at pine-covered valleys below me and a fragile blue sky above, I felt a pervasive, existential anxiety that would then evaporate from the memory of the event, a memory that would be exclusively composed of the objective conditions: the top of a mountain, a fragile blue sky, and would hence be free of everything that had made the actual moment trying. The present was unpleasant not because I might have had a runny nose or been thirsty or forgotten a scarf, but because of my reluctance to accept that I was finally going to live out a possibility that had all year resided in the comforting folds of the future. Yet, as soon as I had reached the bottom of the slope, I would look back up the mountain and declare that it had been a perfect run. And so the skiing holiday and much of my life generally proceeded. Anticipation in the morning, anxiety in the actuality, and pleasant memories in the evening. There was, for a long time, something of this paradox in my relationship with Chloe. I would spend all day looking forward to a meal with her, would come away from it with the best impressions, but find myself faced with a present that had never equaled its anticipation or memory. It was one evening shortly before we left for Spain, on Will Knott's houseboat with Chloe and other friends, when, because everything was so perfect, I first grew unavoidably aware of my lingering suspicions towards the present moment. Most of the time, the present is so flawed to remind us that the disease of living in the present imperfect tense is within us and nothing to do with the world outside. But that evening in Chelsea, there was simply nothing I could fault the moment on, and hence had to realize that the problem lay within me. The food was delicious, friends were there, Chloe was looking beautiful, sitting next to me and holding my hand. And yet something was wrong all the same. The fact that I could not wait till the event had slipped into history. The inability to live in the present lies in the fear of leaving the sheltered position of anticipation or memory, and so of admitting that this is the only life that one is ever likely, heavenly intervention aside, to live. If commitment is seen as a group of eggs, then to commit oneself to the present is to risk putting all one's eggs in the present basket rather than distributing them between the baskets of past and future. And to shift the analogy to love, to finally accept that I was happy with Chloe would have meant accepting that, despite the danger, all of my eggs were firmly in her basket. Whatever pills the good doctor had given her, Chloe seemed completely cured the next morning. We prepared a picnic and went back to the lake, where we passed the day swimming and reading by the water. We spent 10 days in Spain, and I believe, as much as one can trust memory, that for the first time we both risked living those days in the present. Living in this tense did not always mean bliss. The anxieties created by love's unstable happiness routinely exploded into argument. I remember a furious row in the village of Fuente el Espino de Moya, where we had stopped for lunch. It had started with a joke about an old girlfriend and had grown into a suspicion in Chloe's mind that I was still in love with her. Nothing could have been further from the truth, yet I had taken such suspicion to be a projection of Chloe's own declining feelings for me and accused her of as much. By the time the arguing, sulking, and reconciliations were over, it was mid-afternoon, and we were both left wondering what the tears and shouting had been about. There were other arguments. I remember one near the village of Losa del Obispo about whether or not we were bored with one another, another near Sote Quera that had started after I had accused Chloe of being an incompetent map reader, and she had countered the charge by accusing me of road fascism. The reasons behind such arguments were never the surface ones. Whatever Chloe's deficiencies with the guide Michelin or my intolerance to driving around in large circles through the Spanish countryside, what was at stake were far deeper anxieties. The strength of the accusations we made, their sheer implausibility, showed that we argued not because we hated one another, but because we loved one another too much, or, to risk confusing things, because we hated loving one another to the extent we did. Our accusations were loaded with a complicated subtext. I hate you because I love you. It amounted to a fundamental protest. I hate having no choice but to risk loving you like this. The pleasures of depending on someone pale next to the paralyzing fears that such dependence involves. Our occasionally fierce and somewhat inexplicable arguments during our trip through Valencia were nothing but a necessary release of tension that came from realizing that each one had placed all their eggs in the other's basket and was helpless to aim for more sound household management. Our arguments sometimes had an almost theatrical quality to them. A joy and exuberance would manifest itself as we set about destroying the bookshelf, smashing the crockery, or slamming doors. It's nice being able to feel I can hate you like this, Chloe once said to me. It reassures me that you can take it, that I can tell you to fuck off, and you'll throw something at me, but stay put. We needed to shout at one another, partly to see whether or not we could tolerate each other's shouting. We wanted to test each other's capacity for survival. Only if we had tried in vain to destroy one another would we know we were safe. It is easiest to accept happiness when it is brought about through things that one can control, that one has achieved after much effort and reason. But the happiness I had reached with Chloe had not come as a result of any personal achievement or effort. It was simply the outcome of having, by a miracle of divine intervention, found a person whose company was more valuable to me than that of anyone else in the world. Such happiness was dangerous precisely because it was so lacking in self-sufficient permanence. Had I, after months of steady labor, produced a scientific formula that had rocked the world of molecular biology, I would have had no qualms about accepting the happiness that ensued from such a discovery. The difficulty of accepting the happiness Chloe represented came from my absence in the casual process leading to it, and hence my lack of control over the happiness-inducing element in my life. It seemed to have been arranged by the gods and was consequently accompanied by all the primitive fear of divine retribution. All of man's unhappiness comes from an inability to stay in his room alone, said Pascal, advocating a need for man to build up his own resources over and against the debilitating dependence on the social sphere. But how could this possibly be achieved in love? Proust tells the story of Muhammad II, who, sensing that he was falling in love with one of the wives in his harem, at once had her killed, because he did not wish to live in spiritual bondage to another. Short of this, I had long ago given up hopes of achieving self-sufficiency. I had gone out of my room and begun to love another, thereby taking on the risk inseparable from basing one's life around another human being. The anxiety of loving Chloe was in part the anxiety of being in a position where the cause of my happiness might so easily vanish, where she might suddenly lose interest, die, or marry another. At the height of love, there appeared a temptation to end the relationship prematurely so that either Chloe or I could play at being the executioner, rather than see the other partner or habit or familiarity end things. We were sometimes seized by an urge, manifested in our arguments about nothing, to kill our love affair before it had reached its natural end, a murder committed not out of hatred, but out of an excess of love, or rather, out of the fear that an excess of love may bring. Lovers may kill their own love story only because they are unable to tolerate the uncertainty, the sheer risk that their experiment in happiness has delivered. Hanging over every love story is the thought, as horrible as it is unknowable, of how it will end. It is as when, in full health and vigor, we try to imagine our own death, the only difference between the end of love and the end of life being that at least in the latter, we are granted the comforting thought that we will not feel anything after death. No such comfort for the lover who knows that the end of the relationship will not necessarily be the end of love, and almost certainly not the end of life.